All right. Assuming everyone can hear me okay and there isn't any other more objections, I'll begin the first affirmative speech, which is 8 minutes long. Right. In 1985, Hezbollah kidnapped and tortured American journalist Terry A. Anderson. In 2006, Hezbollah waged a war on Israel, killing an estimated 1,000 and leaving over 1 million people displaced without a home. And in September of 2019, Hezbollah launched a missile assault of Israel, killing an untold amount. Our U.S. financial policy is supporting a terrorist organization, and this has to end. That's why Kyle and I affirmed the resolution. States resolved, the United States federal government should substantially reform its banking, finance, and or monetary policy. First off, let's define one big idea, and that is the definition of finance and banking policy. This is according to Ballotpedia, citing the 115th Congress of 2017 and 2018's definition of financial policy. It says, quote, financial and banking policy determines what actions financial institutions, such as banks and insurance companies, may take when conducting their business, as well as how and what agencies may regulate them, end quote. So now that we have this definition for clarity, let's look at the problem at hand. You see, when it comes to stopping one of the deadliest terrorist organizations we face, our financial policy has been our downfall. Fact one, try border funding. In order for terrorism to occur, there must be a source of funding for that organization. Hezbollah is no exception. Their primary source of revenue comes from a region known as the tri-border area. Holly McKay wrote in 2019 that, quote, U.S. authorities consider the tri-border region, comprised of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, as a refuge for transitional crime and terrorist organizations. It is often characterized as the most important Hezbollah base outside of operations in Lebanon, end quote. Think of the tri-border area like the Wild West. Law enforcement is super lax, which creates a safe haven for illegal black markets. Hezbollah sells drugs to generate revenue, which they then transfer to their operations in the Middle East. But for them to conceal their dealings in the TBA, Hezbollah must transfer this money through multiple bank accounts, which leads directly to the harm in the current system. Harm, U.S. financial system abused. It was according to former IMF official Jose Stein and Dr. Emmanuel Ottolenghi in December of 2018, and they said, quote, first, Hezbollah's revenue streams from illicit networks in the Americas is significantly growing, both because Hezbollah's financial needs have expanded and because U.S. sanctions are cutting into Iran's disposable income, which previously funded the group. Second, Hezbollah funnels much of its Latin America proceeds from illicit activities through the U.S. financial system, threatening its integrity, end quote. The last part of this evidence is incredibly important. Hezbollah is exploiting the U.S. financial system in what has been a successful attempt to fund continued terror. The impact of this is U.S. institutions supporting terrorism. In recent years, there have been policies instituted to combat Hezbollah in the Middle East. However, nothing has been done to stop Hezbollah in the TBA since 2006. Hezbollah uses the TBA to gather funds, which then go through the U.S. financial system, enabling them to continue their acts of terror. Of course, U.S. policy denounces terrorism on its face, but simultaneously our own financial institutions allow and support it. This is horrible, because first, it sets a dangerous precedent that we allow criminals to use the U.S. banks, and second, it makes it easier for Hezbollah to launder their money because of how interconnected the U.S. financial system is. As Dr. Daniel Bryan writes, he says, quote, the idea of the United States helping Hezbollah, even indirectly, is rather nauseating. Hezbollah has used its military power to bolster the Syrian regime. Hezbollah has also conducted devastating attacks on U.S. targets in Lebanon in the 1980s. It has kidnapped Americans in Lebanon and assisted Iranian operations around the world, end quote. While Hezbollah might seem like a daunting organization, there is a proven way to cut their funding. Section 311 of the Patriot Act allows us to seal terrorists like Hezbollah out of the U.S. financial system. In fact, Tyler Stapleton, who was a former advisor on intelligence, defense, and national security, testified before the House saying, quote, more can and should be done. Under existing authorities, the administration can take significant steps to curtail Hezbollah's criminal and drug trafficking activities. The U.S. can also apply financial sanctions, such as Section 311 of the U.S. Patriot Act, to target money laundering financial institutions in the tri-border region, end quote. Section 311 blocks Hezbollah from our financial system, which is why we propose the following plan. Plan, isolate banks linked to Hezbollah in the TBA. Mandate 1, designation. Under Section 311 of the Patriot Act, the Treasury Secretary will designate the tri-border areas as a primary money laundering concern. Mandate 2, implement 311. The Treasury Secretary will impose Special Measure 5 under Section 311 on banks in the tri-border area that refuse to close accounts linked to Hezbollah. Any other measures deemed necessary by the Treasury may be applied. This will be passed immediately upon an affirmative ballot and will be carried out and enforced by the Department of Treasury, particularly the Financial Crimes and Enforcement Network, but any other necessary branches may be used. Now, our policy leads to one main advantage, which you can write down as protecting our financial system. A Section 311 designation gives banks a simple option: close the Hezbollah account or be cut off from the U.S. financial system. If banks comply with the U.S., then Hezbollah is cut off from the U.S. financial system. If banks don't comply, then the whole bank, including the Hezbollah accounts, are blocked from our financial system. Historically, the vast majority of banks comply with U.S. demands. However, either possibility would effectively protect U.S. systems from Hezbollah's activities. This is proven because Dr. Aaron Arnold explains that our policy works. He says, quote, a Section 311 designation effectively prevents targeted entities from using the U.S. financial system and transacting in U.S. dollars. The Economist points out that a 311 designation is more often than not a death sentence, end quote. Our plan stops Hezbollah from using the American financial system to fund their terrorist activities. And this leads to the impact, which you can write down as reducing terrorism. Not only does our plan stop the U.S. from participating in Hezbollah's terrorism, it cuts off the majority of their funding, and this will reduce their terrorism. The National Interest wrote in 2019 that, quote, for many years, Hezbollah's foes focused solely on its military capabilities as a source for power, while totally ignoring the Shia party's Achilles heel, its financial resources, end quote. Our nation was founded on freedom. We fight terrorism because it threatens our liberties. It takes the lives of our citizens and propagates suffering. The American financial system should never aid terrorists. It's our responsibility to protect our citizens. In order to do so, we have to target Hezbollah's Achilles heel and stop them financially. Thank you. I'm now ready for any questions my opponents might have about the case.
All right, this is a 3-minute cross-examination. So if you're ready, Winston?
Yes.
All right, then let's get started. Starting off, could I see a copy of your 1IC?
Yeah, we can send that to you.
Sure. Have sanctions in the past affected Hezbollah's funding?
Yes.
And by how much?
I mean, it depends on the sanctions, but we've definitely been able to cut their funding. We have evidence talking about their funding being cut in half, different types of evidence. Depends on the sanctions and where they were put.
Sorry about that, sure. So you would agree that Hezbollah is now getting their funding from other places now, specifically the TBA. So we've cut off funding before, but now they're moving to the TBA, correct?
Yes, we cut off their Middle Eastern funding, which was the majority of funding, as the evidence from Dr. Emmanuel's Ochoa said. They're moving to the TBA.
All right, so Hezbollah is being currently funded pretty well currently.
The TBA, yes, they're able to get a lot of money from that, and that's what's keeping them funded.
Sure. Do other countries have less secure financial systems than the tri-border area?
The tri-border area is one of the most lawless areas in the entire world.
Is it the most lawless is it the most lawless area of the world?
Yes.
Sure. Do you have evidence backing that up? That specifically says that it is the worst area for lawlessness in the world.
Yes, we do.
Sure. Could I see that evidence?
I believe because of basic rules, we're not allowed to pass evidence unless it's been read into round. I could be wrong about that, but we can certainly read into round.
All right. Could your partner read that evidence in the next speech? And then we'd like to ask for that after that.
If it becomes an argument that you guys bring up, we will respond with that evidence.
All right. Sounds good. My partner will be bringing that up in the next speech. So moving on, currently is Hezbollah's funding coming into the United States just through the tri-border area, or are there other places that their funding is coming from?
The tri-border area is the primary source of revenue for Hezbollah. So yes, that's coming from the TBA.
Sure. That wasn't my question. Is that the only area that they're getting their funding from? Or are there other places that their funding is currently coming from?
There are like individuals that will send them money because they support their cause.
Sure. Are there other countries that the U.S. That Hezbollah does launder money through?
Yes, Hezbollah launders money through many countries and bank
Sure.
accounts. But the deal is our policy stops them from being
Sure.
able to use banks in the TBA, so we completely cut that off.
Sure. And am I correct in thinking that your policy only affects the tri-border area and does not touch these other areas, correct?
So if they transferred money through a Swiss bank account, we're not putting sanctions on Switzerland. No.
Oh, sure. So it only touches the tri-border area, not
Our
these
policy
other
is about the
areas.
tri-border area and stopping them using that as a breeding ground for their funding.
Sure. Have 311 sanctions been used on Hezbollah in the past?
I believe so, yes.
How many times?
I'm not sure on the exact numbers. I think we have those back at the table, though.
Oh, sure. If your partner, okay, sure. So moving on, where has Hezbollah gotten its funding in the past?
They've gotten it from Iran, primarily.
Is that the only place?
That's their primary. You asked where the primary was. That's where their primary source of funding was.
All right, no further questions. Okay. No prep time needed. This is an 8-minute constructive speech if the affirmative team and the judges are ready. Perfect. Let's go ahead and begin. A government solution to a problem often makes that problem worse. It's because I agree with award-winning economist Milton Friedman that I believe we should be negating today's debate resolution when we specifically look at implementing 311 sanctions, specifically Special Measure 5, on Hezbollah and the tri-border area. Throughout the speech, it is my goal to show you that the affirmative team is 1, untopical, 2, unsolvent, and then 3rd and finally, we're going to show you how they actually worsen the problem and overall end up hurting and funding terrorism in the long run. So let's go ahead and start off with my first topicality. Topicality 1 is that of not U.S. policy. Again, topicality 1, not U.S. policy. Subpoint A under here is that of foreign policy. Again, subpoint A, foreign policy. Now, it's important to note that the affirmative team is reforming U.S. banks, but it affects foreign policy. The affirmative team is clearly dealing with foreign policy, and we see this from Oxford Dictionary's definition of foreign policy. It says, quote, a government strategy in dealing with other nations, end quote. The affirmative team is reforming other banks in other countries. We are dealing with foreign policy as opposed to United States banking, finance, and/or monetary policy. With this topicality out of the way, let's get into one burden of proof. This burden of proof you can write down as involved in the U.S. Again, involved in the U.S. This burden of proof is pretty simple and easy to fulfill for the affirmative team if the proof is out there. All they have to prove is show an exact number for how much money Hezbollah actually launders through the American financial system. We don't want an estimate. We want an exact number to the exact dollar. This evidence doesn't exist. The affirmative team cannot fulfill this burden. Let's go ahead and move into the solvencies. Solvency 1 is that of other countries. Again, solvency 1, other countries. This is from How Stuff Works in 2017. And they say, quote, the truth is that no individual nation has a power to stop money laundering. If one country is hostile to laundering, criminals simply look elsewhere for a practice to clean their money, end quote. What we see from this is that while the affirmative team may be claiming to harm Hezbollah's funding, they won't actually achieve the goals set before them. What they'll be doing is simply reallocating Hezbollah's funding. They will make it go from coming through the US financial system to going through another country's financial system, whose financial system is possibly weaker. In this scenario, the affirmative team is funding terrorism. And I'll get into that and the disadvantage later on to show you exactly why that is a bad thing. Solvency 2 is that of other sources of money. Again, Solvency 2, other sources of money. This is from VAO News, and they say on April 23rd, 2019, quote, in previous years, Hezbollah has generated about $1 billion annually through direct financial support from Iran, international businesses and investments, donor networks, and money laundering activities. End quote. They later continue, quote, Assistant Secretary for State for Diplomatic Security, Michael T. Evanoff, said during a press briefing on Monday, end quote. Essentially, what we see from this piece of evidence is that Hezbollah's funding is maintaining the standard of strong. Even though 311 sanctions or similar sanctions have been put on Iran in the past, Hezbollah's funding is still at large. The Washington Post writes on May 18th, 2019, quote,
Hezbollah recognizes that Trump may be in office until 2024 and is taking a long-term view, seeking out extra sources of revenue while reviving former ones. He said, in the meantime, Iran will also try to secure new sources of funding. Iran will go back to their old ways from before the nuclear accord, to the black market. He said, they have many alternatives for smuggling. End quote. Essentially, what we see from these pieces of evidence is that Hezbollah's funding will not be stopped. No matter what the affirmative team does in implementing 311 sanctions on the TBA, Hezbollah's funding will remain strong. And we've seen this through past empirics. Liz Sly is the bureau chief covering Lebanon, and she says on May 18th, 2019, quote, Naralsha assured his followers that Hezbollah has secured all of its funding from Iran. As long as Iran has money, we have money, end quote. We see two things from this. One, Hezbollah's funding doesn't even come from the TBA. So the affirmative team is shooting at a goal that doesn't even need solved. Two, Hezbollah's funding is coming from Iran, which means Iran currently has sanctions put on it, yet Hezbollah's funding is remaining strong as seen by other pieces of evidence. The third solvency you can write down as past precedent. Again, solvency 3, past precedent. The U.S. has used 311 sanctions against Hezbollah in the past, but Hezbollah simply changes trafficking routes and continues to operate as before. Instead, it should take a page from the Obama administration playbook in 2011, Lebanese-Canadian bank case, which involved a vast global network run by Hezbollah facilitator Ayman Jumana to launder money for Colombian and Mexican drug cartels. Then the Treasury Department designated designated the bank as an entity of primary money laundering concern under Section 311 of the Patriot Act. The combined blows of the designation and U.S. criminal prosecutions ultimately forced the bank out of business. There are two impacts. Impact one is that of innocence harmed. Again, impact one, innocence harmed. By the affirmative team putting 311 sanctions on banks, they are shutting the banks out of business. So this impacts innocent people's lives. Impact two is that of reallocated funding. Again, impact two, reallocated funding. 311 sanctions have been put on Hezbollah in the past. And what has the outcome been? They just reallocate their funding to a different country with a weaker financial system. The affirmative team's case is completely unsolvent. And this is where we see the disadvantage. Disadvantage one is that of money laundering made easier. Again, disadvantage one, money laundering made easier. Now, the affirmative team stated some interesting facts in their last speech, in the cross-examination specifically. They said that the TBA had the weakest financial system when we're specifically looking at crime and enforcement. This is actually incorrect. The TBA is about the number 14th country, one of the countries in the TBA, is number 14 on the most corrupt when we're looking at financial crimes. Specifically, I'd like to read some of the top 14 for you, just to show you exactly why the affirmative team is unsolvent. This is from basilgovernments.org, and essentially the methodology they used to work this out is they used the World Bank. They use a few different other sources to essentially go through and look at these different countries and see exactly who is more corrupt. And so let me zoom in on this picture here. A few of these examples are Haiti, Libya, Afghanistan, Laos, Mozambique. All these different countries all have weaker financial enforcement and have more financial crime than the TBA. So what do we see from this disadvantage? By passing the affirmative team's plan, what's going to happen is Hezbollah is simply going to move from the TBA to moving to one of these weaker financial, when we look at financial, they're going to move to one of these weaker financial countries. So essentially what's going to happen is their funding is going to increase, yet they're still going to be interacting with the United States and possibly other countries as well. So essentially what we see is that the affirmative team's plan is a big idea on how to reallocate Hezbollah's funding. They aren't solvent, they make their funding actually easier to use, and overall, they worsen the status quo. It is for these reasons, Judge, that I believe you should side with the negative team. Thank you so much.
All right, Malachi, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Awesome. I'll assume everyone else can and get started. Should America fight terrorism?
I believe so.
And why is that?
Because terrorism is inherently bad, as seen in the attack of 9/11, or as seen in the multiple times that people have run trucks through protesting crowds.
Should we ever aid terrorists in any way as a country?
Nope, and that's what we see from this disadvantage, is you guys are going to make terrorism, specifically Hezbollah, more funding, which is why you should not vote affirmative.
Let's go through your speech. Why is it important that we provide the exact details on the dime in terms of numbers of funding? Why is that such an important number?
Because we need to see two things from you. We need to see that, one, there's currently interaction with the United States financial system. Because that number doesn't exist and it's a rough estimate, then we don't even know how bad your harms are. It could be interacting with the US financial system with a small number of money. It could be just a few $100,000. We don't know, and that evidence doesn't exist.
Okay, awesome. Going down to Solvency 1, you talked about other countries. So is you just to make sure I understand the argument correctly, is it that the TBA will continue to be used and that they'll just funnel it not through the American financial system, but through X other country's system? Yes?
Under Solvency 1?
Yes. Is that what you're arguing?
Yes, essentially what we were saying is that one country can't stop a terroristic organization and money laundering.
Okay. So actually I have a bunch of evidence that I would like. So could I have all the cards? So first in primary, can we get the Solvency 3 card talking about where the past precedent? That card definitely want.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send it in the chat after this cross-examination.
Okay. And then can you also send the card about Hezbollah, basically Iran, Hezbollah's funding into Iran? Those, I think there was like 2 cards there that were good.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear, the Iran funding and then the one about 311 sanctions in the past?
Yeah, the past one, probably the most important one, if we can get any of them.
Absolutely. I'll get those for you.
Okay. Let's move down to the disadvantage. So what you talked about this study. What was the methodology for the study? How did they conduct this study?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can provide you with the methodology. I don't know all of it off the top of my head. I don't have it like pre-scripted out, but I can go ahead and send the methodology for you. But essentially what they did is they went and looked at a bunch of different federal agencies from different countries and in our own country, and essentially looked at these different countries' financial enforcement specifically and found which ones were weaker. So I'll go ahead and send that to you if you would like.
Yeah, sure. Just to be clear, was it talking about money laundering or just crime in general? What exactly was it looking at?
Yeah, it was talking about financial crimes, and that would relate to money laundering.
Okay, awesome.
And it was specific to money laundering and terrorist financing, to be exact.
Yeah, and so it basically looked at every single country and determined how well that they dealt with terrorist financing, money, crimes, etc. Correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So underneath your topicality press, your argument here is that we're not reforming, we're just affecting the U.S. system. What exactly is the distinction here?
Yeah, essentially. So you're reforming banks in other countries and the idea that you're putting sanctions on banks in other countries. So you are actually dealing with foreign policy as opposed to American policy.
Okay, thanks for the distinction. Thank you so much for the answers.
No problem.
Right, we'll begin in just a moment of prep time.
Okay, I'll go ahead and send that evidence right now. Okay, there's the evidence specifically regarding 311 sanctions being used in the past.
All right, we won't need any more prep time. We have 4 minutes and 20 seconds remaining. If we're all ready? All right, I'll go ahead and begin this 8-minute speech then. As our opponents agreed in cross-examination, America should never fund terrorism. It's ultimately because of that simple principle that we have to be taking action. I want to respond to Malachi's last speech in its entirety, but I want to start off with one main observation. And that observation is of our goal. I think this is going to be the most important argument in this round. Our goal as the affirmative is not necessarily to wipe Hezbollah off the face of the earth, but to make sure they don't use our financial system. That will be incredibly important as we talk about solvency. But starting off at topicality, they said it's not US policy, rather foreign policy. My response is of domestic policy, international effects. While our policy might affect the international sphere, it's reforming US banks. In fact, it was according to the US Department of Treasury that, quote, Section 311 grants the Secretary of Treasury the authority to require domestic financial institutions and financial agencies to take special measures, unquote. Here's the way our policy works. It tells domestic US banks they can't work with banks in the TBA that work with Hezbollah. we're mandating and basically regulating United States banks. That's domestic US foreign policy. The impact is of topical reform. Even if we affect other nations, the reform, what has to be topical, is topical. Now let's talk about the burden. Malachi said we have to give an exact number, like on the dime, an exact dollar amount of how much is going through the US. Two responses. My first response is exact number unnecessary. Malachi just gave this burden but never gave any justification for it. Our burden is the affirmative is to prove a significant problem. We don't need an exact dollar amount to prove that. My second response is of 420 million in one case alone. According to Jose Luis Stein, a former IMF official, on December 12, 2018, quote, recent media coverage illustrates the magnitude of the problem. Paraguay linked the Mega Lovato, a $1.2 billion money laundering scheme, to Hezbollah. And later in the article, according to ABC Color, 420 million, or about 1/3 of the money, was laundered through US banks, unquote. We'll be seeing in later evidence how it's actually a $1 billion problem. But what this proves is in one case, again, one case alone, it was 420 million through the US financial system. There's a significant problem. Let's talk about solvency. Their first solvency with other countries. Two responses. My first response, the TBA is unique. We'll be addressing our opponent's evidence under the disadvantage later, but in cross-examination, they asked for evidence proving the tri-border area is the most lawless area. Well, it was according to Matthew Levitt, the director of the Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism at the Washington Institute, that, quote, a region routinely called the United Nations of Crime, a classic terrorist safe haven and a counterfeiting capital. The tri-border area is a natural home for operatives seeking to build financial and logistical Hezbollah support networks within communities, unquote. I want to point you to those three labels of the TBA: United Nations of Crime, classic terrorist safe haven, counterfeiting capital. Those aren't tags that are thrown around for no reason. And the reason why is because, like, unlike any other land, the TBA has so little law enforcement and is so corrupt that Hezbollah can launder money through it. The reason why that matters is because we've already fought off other areas, blocking Hezbollah out of the TBA keeps them out of our financial system. My second response is terrible precedent. This is really important. Even if Hezbollah can move elsewhere, it's a terrible policy to say that we shouldn't stop them where we can. Think about it like this. Murder is worse than human trafficking. Does that mean we shouldn't stop murder? Absolutely not. Now let's talk about solvency two of other sources. They talked about Iran. Three responses. Response number one, Iranian funding already fought. It was according to journalist Poya Stone, writing for Iran-focused news and analysis on May 29, 2019, that, quote, in early November, the sanctions reimposed by the US targeted Iran's oil revenue. The sanctions have forced Tehran to cut funding for its proxy group Hezbollah. Now the group is facing an economic crisis because Hezbollah's annual income from Iran was said to be around 700 million. But already, the monthly shipments of cash from Tehran are reported to have been cut in half, unquote. Winston actually read evidence about this in the 1AC. We've already taken action against Iran. And while our opponent's evidence might sound new, their $1 billion estimate actually comes from a 2018 report. So looking at this updated evidence, essentially the money has already been cut in half and it's already going down further. My second response, shifting to the TBA. Winston read evidence from Dr. Emmanuel Ottolenghi that simply said because we're cutting them off in Iran, Hezbollah is actually moving funds to the TBA. Iran actually proves our point. My third response is our goal. Even if Hezbollah can use Iran, that's not coming from the US financial system, and we still achieve our goal. That is incredibly important. Now let's talk about Solvency 3. They talked about cutting off one bank in Colombia. Two responses. First, one bank versus region. This is not comparable to our policy. The reason why Hezbollah still existed is we only targeted one bank. Our policy targets the entire region they're laundering money through. That's why we solve. They also said innocents were harmed. My response is cartels aren't innocent. We shut down a cartel running bank. That's not an innocent bank. Now let's talk about the disadvantage. They said we're making money laundering easier. I have three responses. First, study doesn't apply. The reason why is they're comparing regions to countries. Even if Paraguay as a country might not be the most lawless, the region of the TBA is. Their policy talks about the most lawless country. It doesn't talk about the most lawless region. Our evidence from the Reinhardt Institute already proved the most lawless region is the TBA. That's where we cut them out. My second response, other countries already fought. They talked about areas like West Africa and Iran. Again, we've already fought West Africa and Iran. The only problem is in the TBA. My third response, global access lost. Again, global access lost. According to former counterterrorism financing official David Carles in 2016, quote, Section 311 allows FinCEN to disrupt target activities in support of US and international security aims. This way, FinCEN can shut the target out of the US financial system. Furthermore, the fifth special measure can often result in the target being denied complete access to the global financial system, unquote. The reason why is Section 311 sets a precedent. It says if you work with Hezbollah, you're not going to be allowed in our financial system. No legitimate bank will choose a terrorist organization above the US. So our policy keeps Hezbollah out of the TBA, and on top of that, it sets a precedent that keeps them out of the global financial system. I want to end off with one more observation. That's of $1 billion problem. It was according to Dr. Emmanuel Ottolenghi on February 6, 2020, that, quote, the TBA is Hezbollah's main hub of activities in the continent. And over the past 4 decades, through a network of local residents, Hezbollah has established an extensive trade-based money laundering network that is currently laundering billions of dollars on behalf of regional organized crime syndicates, unquote. Remember that last phrase, billions of dollars. The problem is not in Iran. The problem is not in West Africa. As that evidence, as well as the Reinhardt evidence proved, the problem is in the TBA. There's a problem in the current system. We're financing terror. Our policy is proven to succeed and keeps Hezbollah out.
Perfect. 3 minutes of cross-examination when you're ready.
Good to go.
All right, let's go ahead and begin. Great speech, Kyle. Now, of course, I have a couple of questions for you regarding your argumentation, specifically starting off with your response to the burden of proof. You talk about a number of about $420 million that have been brought through the U.S. financial system. Where was this money from? Was it from the TBA?
Yes, it was from the TBA.
Okay, would you mind if we see that evidence?
Oh, absolutely. I'll send it right
Okay,
over.
and then awesome if you could send us the evidence under the observation, specifically looking at the billions that have been laundered. And
Yes, will do.
specifically, okay, awesome, thank you so much. And specifically regarding that last observation point that you made, is that billions that was laundered all through the US financial system?
It didn't specify, it said through the tri-border area, but as Winston read, the majority goes through the US. That was the
Okay,
closing
so
response.
can you give me a rough estimate for how much comes through the United States, backed by evidence, please?
That's actually the problem in the current system. Because we don't have any proper designation, we aren't able to subpoena intelligence. Our policy under Mandate 1 allows us to get that specific information of the exact dollar amount.
Okay, how will you do that
further
now if
explain
we can't, how will you do that after your plan is passed if we can't do that now?
Yeah, the reason is subpoena authority. The United States can't just subpoena any record they want. They need proper designation, specifically the idea of primary money laundering concern. So it essentially gives the government permission.
Okay, and how exactly would they find that number?
Okay, there's actually this organization called SWIFT, which logs every single international bank transaction. That's one such organization we can subpoena to get information, though there's others.
Interesting. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to some other arguments. Specifically, under your response of TBA being unique in response to the first solvency, you basically talked about how, actually, could you go ahead and read that evidence for me, just from where you
Yes.
started to where you ended?
Absolutely. Let me find that card right here. All right. According to Matthew Levitt, quote, a region routinely called the United Nations of Crime, a classic terrorist safe haven, and a counterfeiting capital. The tri-border area is a natural home for operatives seeking to build financial and logistical Hezbollah support networks within Shia and Lebanese diaspora communities. Unquote.
Okay. Okay, can you go ahead and send that evidence to me? And then later on in your speech, you said that that evidence specifically said that TBA was the worst region. Where does it say that? Because I don't believe it did.
Yes, 3 phrases. The United Nations of Crime. You don't call something the United Nations of Crime unless it is the worst. Second, a classic terrorist safe haven and a counterfeiting capital.
Just to be clear, it doesn't actually specifically refer to it as the worst, like you said it did. Is that correct?
No, it calls it the United Nations of Crime. That's calling it the worst.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Moving down to disadvantage, specifically looking at your response of doesn't apply. Would you agree that other countries have weaker financial systems
Than the United States or than the TBA?
than the TBA?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Okay, so are you disagreeing with this evidence specifically?
Yes, and the reason why is because I was talking about countries, not a region. While other countries might be more weak than, say, Paraguay specifically, the region of the TBA is the most worse.
Okay, so you agree that other countries are weaker?
Other countries, not other regions. There's a big difference here.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much, Kyle. If you go ahead and send all that evidence that we asked for, then we will start prep time.
Awesome. Can you put a note of that in the chat? Because I believe you wanted 3 cards.
Yes, specifically
Okay,
the
thanks.
evidence. Okay, we'll go ahead and start prep time then.
And I'm getting it for you right now. I sent the evidence via email. That way it keeps the formatting for you guys.
All right, thank you.
Stopping negative team prep time, 2 minutes and 29 seconds on the clock.
All right, this is an 8-minute speech. So if the affirmative team is ready. All right, sounds good. Then let's get started. One of the greatest mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. It's because my partner and I agree with Milton Friedman when he said this, that the affirmative team's policy, while it may have good intentions of stopping terrorism and keeping Hezbollah out of our financial system, the results are disappointing. Not only do we see that it won't actually solve because Hezbollah will just move to other less secure financial systems, we also see disadvantages that come about that ultimately make the system worse. I want to make one thing very clear. Both teams in today's debate round agree that terrorism is a bad thing. The United States should not be supporting terrorism. We should be doing what we can to stop it. However, the affirmative team's policy does not do that. Why are we wasting our time debating a policy that does not stop terrorism? We should be focusing our resources in doing something that will actually work. The affirmative team's policy does not do that. Let's take a look at some reasons why. In response to harm 1, that of US financial system abused, my response is that of proves insolvency. Again, proves insolvency. I'd like to read their evidence here one more time. It says this quote, first, Hezbollah's revenue stream from illicit networks in the Americas is significantly growing, both because Hezbollah's financial needs have expanded and because US sanctions are cutting into Iran's disposable income, end quote. If you remember my partner's solvency point, he talked about how once we use 311 sanctions on the tri-border area, all they have to do is move to another country and continue to launder money through that country. What the affirmative team's own evidence proves is that their plan is insolvent. Once we use 311 sanctions on Iran and the source of funding there, All they had to do was move to the Americas, which is what caused that to grow. What's stopping them to moving to one of these other countries, such as Mozambique, Haiti, and causing these nations to once again become the United Nations of crime? Moving on to the plan text, I have 3 responses. First response is that of unlimited power. Again, unlimited power. According to the plan text itself, it says this quote, any other measures deemed necessary by the Treasury may be applied. Now that's dangerous. We're giving the Treasury of the United States unlimited power to do whatever they, quote unquote, deem necessary to stop Hezbollah. That's dangerous. My second response here is that of no funding for enforcement. Again, no funding for enforcement. What we see is that under their plan text, they don't actually provide a source of funding. This is extremely important because there's actually no way for them to enforce their plan. The Treasury already has a set budget that it allocates and allocates to these different programs. However, they don't actually have a set budget for the specific policy that the affirmative team is wanting to pass, quite simply because it hasn't been passed yet. Therefore, there's actually no way for them to implement their policy because there's no funding to enforce it. That's one of the key points of a policy. The affirmative team feels that. My third response is that of no sanction selected. Again, no sanction selected. The Treasury Secretary must select which specific sanction to use from a list of 5 options. Now, the affirmative team does select Special Measure 5, but according to the Treasury themselves, they say this quote, Special Measure 5 is prohibition or conditions on the opening or maintaining of correspondent or payable through accounts. Now, the key words here are prohibition or conditions. Special Measure 5 itself is split into 2 different sanctions. Either you can prohibit these accounts or you can put conditions on these accounts. The affirmative team doesn't specify which, therefore their policy can't actually hold up in the real world when it goes to be applied and implemented. Not only that, they don't even have funding for it. Moving on to some off-case responses, my first argument here is that of an inherency point. You can write this inherency down as Hezbollah already targeted. Again, inherency, Hezbollah already targeted. Subpoint A is that of financial institutions already targeted. Again, subpoint A, financial institutions already targeted. According to David Schechner and Catherine Bohr, she said this quote, the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act, which was signed into law in mid-December 2015, targets financial institutions found to knowingly facilitate a significant transaction on behalf of Hezbollah or anyone affiliated with it, or acting on its behalf. Similar to authorities adopted vis-a-vis Iran prior to the nuclear deal. HIFPA empowers the U.S. Treasury Department to cut off such institutions from accessing the U.S. financial system. In recent years, a series of U.S. actions has constrained Hezbollah's financial operations, but the pressure has been increased by HIFPA. Today, according to Acting Treasury Undersecretary Adam Zubin, the organization is in its worst financial shape in decades, end quote. What this piece of evidence tells us is that there's already a law in place that does not allow any financial institutions to work with Hezbollah. The affirmative team's policy has already been passed. What we have to do is ensure that this policy is enforced rather than passing the same policy that says the same thing over and over again without seeing any actual results. Intentions don't matter as much as the results. Subpoint B is that of already identified as terrorists. Again, subpoint B, already identified as terrorists. According to the Department of Treasury, they said this quote, Hezbollah was designated by the Department of State as a foreign terrorist organization in October 1997 and as a specially designated global terrorist underneath Executive Order 13224 in October 2001. Once again, according to the Treasury, they said this quote, designations brought by Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control are applied more broadly, prohibit transactions, and trigger asset freezing obligations. See, what we see here is that we already have these policies in place. We've already identified Hezbollah as a terrorist organization and made it illegal to help them. These designations, which, as the evidence says, are applied more broadly and prohibit transactions. We have laws in place stopping Hezbollah. What we need to do is more funding to these laws instead of passing policies that repeat the same thing over and over again without any additional funding. That's exactly the affirmative team's policy. My disadvantage is that of hurts innocent people. Again, disadvantage, hurts innocent people. Subpoint A, actually, according to Naija Husari, he said this quote, new US sanctions on Hezbollah would end up having wider repercussions on Lebanon and are therefore unfair to the country as a whole, politicians and economics have said. According to James Chen, he said this quote, the business, finance, and investment communities are more likely to be affected by heightened documentation requirements and due diligence responsibilities, though the impact is more on institutions than individual investors. Anyone who conducts international business is likely to experience added costs and greater hassles with something as mundane as opening a simple foreign checking account, end quote. What we see here is that something as simple as opening a foreign checking account is going to take a lot more time under the affirmative team's plan. Their plan affects people that it should not be affecting, and it doesn't even stop Hezbollah, which they claim to do. My final argument here is that of a solvency point, only temporary fix. Again, solvency, only temporary fix. If we actually take a look at the past of 311 sanctions, they've all been removed or rescinded within a few years of them being put into effect. Specifically, what we see from Iran, and my partner read evidence about this in the last speech, that 311 sanctions were used on Iran, but now they're going back to this. They're reviving means of funding, and this is only a temporary fix. It does not solve the root problem. Thanks. And I now stand open for any questions that the affirmative may have.
Ready to go, Nathan?
Yes.
Right, let's go ahead and begin. So it's your belief that there are areas worse than the TBA, is that correct?
Of course. That's exactly what the evidence says.
All right, so if there's regions worse than the TBA, why is Hezbollah using the tri-border area?
Because they already have different they already have different money laundering paths set up there. But all they have to do is just...
Do you have any evidence that they're in Haiti or other areas currently?
No, but once again, as the affirmative team themselves said in cross-examination, they do get their sources of money from other places.
So Nathan, you have no evidence they're in Haiti. So why are they using the TBA and not Haiti primarily, if Haiti is so bad?
Because they already have these different money laundering paths set up in the tri-border area. They're already comfortable here, but once we kick them out, all they'll do is move.
But to confirm, your only evidence is they have Iranian funding. You have no evidence they're using Haiti or any of those other 14 countries you mentioned. Is that right?
It's not our contention that they're using these other countries currently, but that they will do so because they are less financially secure.
Sure. Now, should human trafficking be illegal in the United States?
Yes, I believe so.
Can't human trafficking just move to other nations then?
Sure, but what your policy doesn't do is stop Hezbollah from putting money into other countries and then going into the United States and back to Hezbollah.
All right. Now, if we find 3 Al-Qaeda bases and we can take out one, but the other 2 remain, should we still take out that one base while we can?
Of course, but your policy does nothing to Hezbollah.
So talking about your study of the 14 countries like Haiti, was that talking about countries or regions?
It was talking specifically about countries.
Okay. Can there be a country that is overall safe but might have some dangerous regions within it?
So the tri-border area is a country composed of 3 regions. It's a region composed of 3 countries.
Yes.
So that doesn't necessarily apply to today's debate round.
Okay, well, is it possible for there to be some areas more dangerous in a country than other areas?
I don't believe so in regards to today's debate round, because what we see is that these individual countries are are less financially secure than all the.
How about this, Nathan? In America, there's some states that are generally financially stable, but there might be some bad neighborhoods in those states, correct?
Sure.
Okay. Now, you talked about the FTO list. Exactly what does the FTO list do?
It's a list of different terrorist organizations, and once you're designated as one of those, the Treasury then has the authority to prohibit transactions and freeze asset designations.
Do you have any evidence it targets foreign financial institutions?
I would have to go back to the evidence and read that.
Okay, and do you have any evidence saying that Hezbollah has ever been targeted in the tri-border area under HIFPA specifically?
No, I do not. So I actually just went back and read the evidence for the last question. It does say the foreign assets control, so it would affect foreign countries.
Okay, and your disadvantage talked about Lebanon, is that correct?
It did. One piece of evidence specifically talked about Lebanon, but the other one also talked about U.S. citizens as a whole.
Thank you. If I could see all the evidence read under the disadvantage, the solvency of temporary, and the inherency, that would be great.
Sure. I didn't actually read any evidence under my solvency of temporary. My partner already sent the evidence about Iran in the last speech that I cited.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Malachi, if you're speaking, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Okay, take 2. All right. The affirmative team has stated their goal time and time again. However, it is my goal ultimately at the end of the speech to show you exactly why the affirmative team does not achieve their observation of our goal. I'd like to start off by responding to Kyle's observation of our goal by saying failed goal. Again, failed goal. Now, the affirmative team does several different things, but one thing they do not do is prove that the Hezbollah will be locked out of the American financial system. Why? Because Hezbollah can simply move to another country and still use and launder money through the American financial system. Let's go ahead and move down to the topicality. His response was that of domestic policy, and then it talked about impacting foreign banks or international banks. My response is that of foreign goal. Now, I'd like to read Special Measure 5, specifically that the affirmative team is implementing. Special Measure 5 reads as from the federal or U.S. Treasury as, quote, prohibitions or conditions on the opening or maintaining of correspondent or payable through accounts, end quote. Specifically, Special Measure 5 is dealing with the prohibitions or conditions on accounts in other countries. We are clearly not reforming American banking or finance or monetary policy. The affirmative team has failed one of their many burdens. Let's go ahead and move into the burden of proof. He had 2 responses. His first response was of 420 million in one case. And then he had a second response looking at exact number isn't needed. My one response is that of failed burden. Again, failed burden. The affirmative team cannot even provide you with a single piece of evidence that states how much of an estimate of the money that comes through the US financial system. And the reason we need to see this evidence is because it applies to their harms. If there's such a big harm and there's a need for federal policy, then we need to see specifics. This plan would never be passed in Congress because it does not have specifics on how much money Hezbollah is actually laundering through the American financial system. The evidence does not exist because there is no problem. Let's go ahead and move down into the solvencies. In response to Solvency 1, specifically looking at other countries, his response was that of TBA unique and a terrible precedent. In response to TBA unique my response is that of not worse. Again, as we agreed in cross-examination between Kyle and I, the tri-border area is not the worst country and or region. We go ahead and look at the evidence that I read. We see other countries. He agreed that other countries have weaker financial systems. Moving down to the terrible precedent, my response is that of terrible goal. Again, terrible goal. The affirmative team is simply reallocating to Hezbollah's funding. Let's go ahead and move down into the second solvency. In response to the second solvency, he talked about Iranian funding already fought. My response is funding coming back. Their funding is clearly coming back. Hezbollah is continuing to be funded. Moving down to the shifting to TVA response he brought up, my response is where next? This proves my point exactly. They've shifted from Iran to the TBA, so they can shift to another country. Kyle proved my point by bringing up this response. Let's go ahead and move down into the last solvency, that of the past precedent. His first response was that of one bank, and then he brought up another response talking about how it was not an innocent bank. My first response is that of no evidence. At the beginning of the round, Judge, you asked for evidence. Kyle provided none under a lot of the arguments he actually brought up. However, my second response is that of innocent bank. Again, innocent bank. This bank was innocent while it did have money laundering inside of it, and it was supporting drug cartels in some ways. It was an innocent bank, and the idea that it still had innocent American and different people's accounts involved in it. And they shut this bank out of business. And this will happen to other banks all throughout the United States and other countries. Moving down to disadvantage, he had a few different responses. His first response was that of doesn't apply. I have one response to this, is that of no warrant. Again, no warrant. His idea was that, well, we're dealing with regions, not countries. This is ridiculous, Judge. If we look to other countries and they have a weaker financial system, Hezbollah can easily move there. In fact, the only evidence we've seen that actually talked and gave legitimate facts is from the negative team. The affirmative team's evidence doesn't even specifically say that the TBA is specifically the worst region in the world. And Kyle actually misrepresented this in his speech. And that's my second response, misrepresentation. Now, Kyle led the evidence out to believe and told us that the evidence specifically said that it was unique to the TBA and that the TBA was uniquely the worst. However, this is not what the evidence said. It stated 3 facts, but it did not say anything about it being the worst region or worst country. This is simply a misrepresentation by Kyle. In response to the observation specifically looking at billions. My response is not in the United States. Again, not in the United States. This is not talking about money going through the United States financial system. This is just talking about funding that Hezbollah has. And it's not even an exact number. It's an estimate. Let's go ahead and take a look at the last argument. My partner will actually be covering it, but basically they don't affect the global, sorry. For all these reasons, I should vote for the negative team. Thank you.
All right, we'll be using a little bit of prep time, 4 minutes and 30 seconds remaining, I believe.
If you guys can send all the evidence regarding Iran under Solvency 2 to our email, that would be great.
Stopping prep time. Right. If everyone can hear me okay?
Yeah, just as a side note, the evidence has been sent for both the disadvantage, the inherency, and the solvency evidence.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. If everyone can hear me all right, we'll get started. The problem here is that Hezbollah is using our financial system as a washing machine for their dirty money to continue their terrorism financing. Our policy solves that, which is why you should vote for it. Let's go into the responses, starting off with Nathan's speech. First, he talked about responding to the harm. He says proves insolvency. I have two responses. Basically, his point here is that they went to another area. Right? My first response is already present. This is something actually Nathan talked about in cross-examination. They were already present there, which is why they're shifting to that area. And they moved there because it's the United Nations of crime. You can take my response as not the same. There isn't any region that's exactly the same as the TPA. We'll be getting to that in some further responses, but I just want to throw that out there as a response. Now, going into the plan, they talked about the idea of unlimited power. Basically, that they would be able to put any measures they deem necessary. Take my response as any special measures. This policy is talking about the measures of there's 5 different measures for Section 311. That's what that mandate's talking about. It's talking about those 5 measures. They can't just do whatever they want. They have to use one of those 5 measures. That's what the mandate was talking about. They talked about no funding. You tag in my response as workers already paid. We're hiring a bunch of new people or doing anything new. We're using FinCEN workers that are already there and already are being paid and already have a budget. Those are the ones that would be doing this. No funding is needed for the plan. It's already being allocated to FinCEN. They said no sanction was selected. This was the idea of the either or question. You can tag my response is we mandate conditions. In our policy, we say that we will put the 311 sanction on them unless they close account. We mandate conditions in our plan, so we do choose one. We're choosing not prohibitions, we're choosing the conditions that's mandated in our plan. Now let's go into their inherency. This is talking about how Hezbollah is already being targeted. You can tag my response as not effective. We read evidence talking about how they're shifting to the TVA. We read evidence talking about how they're still getting money even after HIFPA was passed, meaning that it's not effective. They talked about the idea of it's already being a terrorist threat. You can tag my response as still laundering. The fact that we've labeled them as a terrorist means nothing if the fact is they're still making money. They're still laundering money. That's still happening, which means that our policy enforces pre-existing law. And that's something they even said in their speech was a good thing. They talked about a temporary fix. You can tag my response as removed after effective. The reason removed the primary money laundering concern in those cases is because it was effective. And the other thing is that some of those bills had timelines for how long we put them in place. Ours is indefinite. This isn't really an issue, just proving our plan. And the last thing he brought up was a disadvantage. He talked about how it hurts the innocent people. Two responses. First, the Middle East specific. The evidence talked about Lebanese people being harmed. That's Middle East specific, and that's not the entire issue. We're talking about the TBA. That won't, sanctions in the TBA aren't going to affect Lebanese innocent people. Second response is worth the trade. They talked about inconvenience for opening an account, stopping a terrorist organization from using the United States financial system illegally to fund terrorism. That's a worthwhile trade at the end of the day. Let's go into the topicality press. He talked about it was a foreign goal. You can take my response, reform is key. You see, our policy is about reforming US policy. He ignored all my partner's arguments and argumentation and evidence proving that it is a domestic reform. It reforms and regulates US banks, and that affects other policies. And that's a reform on US banks, and that is topical. Going down to the burden, he said failed burden. You can tag my response as ignored reasoning. My partner gave reasoning why that burden's inaccurate, and also that we'll be able to get those details after our plan, and that we have enough information to pass our plan. They ignored that response. They talked about the TBA. They said it's not the worst. You can tag my response as not whole country. I think my opponents are misunderstanding when they're using this study in the disadvantage. The TBA is not the entirety of Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. It's the small part where they all connect. It's a small region. So for them to compare a country to a region is completely false. If we look to the evidence we read, it talked about it being the United Nations of crime. This is the worst scenario. Like it didn't put a list. The evidence, I will admit, didn't have like a list. We're not going to say that it did, but it's saying that it is the worst region when we're talking about crime. There's a reason that Hezbollah is there, and there's a reason that there's so much criminal drug trafficking taking place in that area. Now they talked about terrible precedent. They basically said they can relocate. Again, they dropped the argument of global access loss, so they can't actually relocate because they'll be dropped around the world. And also, they kind of missed the point. We're saying that even if they could go somewhere else, we should take them out here. They missed the point of the argument. They talked about Iran is getting more funding. Again, they dropped the evidence my partner read that specifically said their funding is being cut in half. They just simply made a claim without any evidence and ignored the facts and evidence that we brought up. They talked about their Solvency 3. They said that we had no evidence that it was an innocent bank. You can take our response as working with a terrorist. We read their evidence, and it talked about them working with a terrorist. Lastly, with the disadvantage of money laundering, they said that we had no warrant and we were misrepresenting it. You can take my response as United Nations of crime. I already talked about this. This is the worst scenario. And again, this doesn't apply. The other thing is that this is a region, or my second response is incompatible. We're talking about a region versus countries. We can't compare this list. What we see is the TBA is unique and is the problem. Advocates say we should pass our plan and that it will be effective. And at the end of the day, that's what I ask you to vote for. Thank you.
All right, starting negative prep time, 2 minutes and 29 seconds remaining, starting now. All right. No further prep time is required. This is a 5-minute rebuttal. So as long as the affirmative team is ready. All right, then let's get started. The very definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. It's because my partner and I believe that the affirmative team's policy has been passed before and will only be passed again, that repeats the same thing over and over again, and yet has the same result of not stopping Hezbollah. We ask that you stand with the negative team and do not pass the affirmative team's plan, which only worsens the problem. I'd like to dive into a few quick responses before bringing up two main voting issues about why the negative team has won your vote today. One quick response, he talked about how workers are already paid, talking about how there's no funding for enforcement. My response is that of new actions. Again, new actions. Sure, workers are already being paid. However, their plan implements new actions that these workers have to do, which means that they have to spend more time here, which means that they have to be paid more. So the affirmative team's policy has no funding. It cannot actually enforce their plan. Enforcement is what we need in order to stop Hezbollah. The next argument was that of the tri-border area is just a portion of these three countries. First of all, they didn't bring up any evidence for this. Second of all, I'd like to read you the evidence that they read in their 1AC. It says that the tri-border area is a region comprised of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. Quite simply, these are three countries, the very least financially secure of which only ranks 14 on a credible study that has never been contested. The next argument was that this is the United Nations of crime. My response is that of financial security. Again, no financial security. Under this piece of evidence, it doesn't actually talk about financial security or stability. It only talks about how much crime is going on there. What our study actually cites is whether or not these financial institutions and countries are financially secure or not. Now, there's a reason why the tri-border area is the United Nations of crime. Maybe even there is the most crime going on there right now. However, once we pass the affirmative team's policy and lock Hezbollah out of there, they will be forced to relocate, and the next country will become the United Nations of crime. Their evidence never says anything about financial stability or financial security. The only evidence addressing financial security and stability is the negatives. And that says that there are 13 other countries less financially secure than the tri-border area. 3 voting issues. The first voting issue is that of useless debate. Again, voting issue 1, useless debate. The reason why this is a useless debate is because the affirmative team's plan does not fall under the resolution. Therefore, there's no reason why we should even be debating it. They talked about how reform is key and how they're reforming US policy and the effects are international. However, I would disagree. The main goal of their plan is to affect terrorists, which is foreign. That's definitely a foreign policy. Just for example, if I were to pass a foreign aid policy, it might affect farmers in the United States. But the main goal here is to help other countries through foreign aid. Sure, it may even reform US farmers. The main goal here is helping other countries through foreign aid, therefore foreign aid policy. The main goal here is stopping terrorists, therefore foreign policy. I'd like to read you the evidence that they themselves read in their plan text itself. The plan text says the Treasury Secretary will impose Special Measure 5 under Section 311 on banks in the tri-border area. What we see here is that their own plan text, their own mandates confirms the negative team's standpoint that they are only reforming banks in other countries, not necessarily the United States. My second voting issue is that of worsens the problem. Again, voting issue 2 worsens the problem. We've already talked about how there's other countries that have less secure financial systems than than the tri-border area. What we see is that once we pass the affirmative team's plan, all Hezbollah has to do is relocate like they've done before in the past. And now we have even more money laundering on our hands. Not only that, their plan hurts innocent people, such as innocent United States citizens simply trying to open a checking account. My third voting issue is that of enforce past policies, don't repeat. Again, enforce past policies, don't repeat. What we see from the inherency is that we have these policies in place already. We've already banned transactions helping Hezbollah. We've already labeled them as terrorist organizations. what we see from the solvencies is that we've already used 311 sanctions on them in the past before. All they've done is move to other countries with less secure financial systems. What we do not need is more policy simply repeating the same thing over and over again, but rather a policy that provides funding, enforcement, and ultimately stops Hezbollah. The AFF plan does not do that. Thanks.
We'll begin prep time. We have 2 minutes 58. All right, we won't be needing any more prep time. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. In my very first constructive speech, I gave a response of global access loss. And I want you to remember this evidence from David Carlis that I read in my very first speech. That quote, the fifth special measure can often result in the target being denied access to the global financial system. It's because our policy sets a precedent that keeps Hezbollah out of the global financial system and out of our financial system that we ask for an affirmative ballot. In this speech, I'm going to have 4 responses and 3 voting issues. Starting off at new actions regarding no funding, my response is hired for enforcement. We don't need to have any funding because we already have FinCEN workers specifically hired to enforce the law. Next off, let's talk about no evidence regarding the idea of essentially how the TBA is a whole country. Our opponents basically claim the TBA is the entirety of Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. It's not a region. My response is tri-border region. Winston read evidence in his 1AC from Holly McKay, who called it the tri-border region. Why? Because the TBA is a region, not the 3 countries next to each other. I also want to point out our opponents had literally no evidence saying it was all 3 countries. We call it the TBA for a reason because it's 3 borders in a region. It's literally in the name. Next up, regarding the voting issue of useless debate, they said our policy is not topical. My response is of domestic reform. We have to prove that we're reforming policy, not necessarily that our impacts are especially basically linked domestically specific. You know, think about it like this. If we made a healthcare reform that led to more people from India, say, immigrating to the US, that would still be a healthcare reform because we're changing healthcare law. Our policy tells domestic US banks they can't work with banks in the TBA working with Hezbollah. It's inherently domestic financial policy. Regarding their third voting issue, to essentially enforce existing law, my response is that past policies are inherently flawed. Winston responded in his last speech and it was never responded to. I want to pull through two distinctions. The first distinction, or subpoint A, is can't target the TBA. As Winston mentioned, we haven't targeted the TBA since 2006. Why? Because under these laws like HIFPA, it can only target things called state sponsors of terrorism. The TBA is not currently labeled an SST, and because of that, the current system cannot take any action. Subpoint B is designation, not enforcement. Winston also pointed this out. While the existing laws might put in certain designation, they don't actually take any specific action. Our policy takes specific action. That's why it's necessary. Let's boil this down to three voting issues. Voting issue 1 is of global access loss. I think this is by far the most important argument in this round. And if there's one argument I want you to remember, it's this one, because it responds to our opponent's entire case. Our opponents keep saying, well, Hezbollah can move elsewhere. Remember the evidence from David Carley's. When we use Special Measure 5 on a region, it sets a precedent that stops global banks from transacting for that terror organization. And the logic is basically this. Basically, no financial system would want to choose one terrorist over the entirety of the US. If they know the US is going to take action against them if they fund that terrorist organization, they won't. That's what precedent shows, and that's what the evidence shows. The impact is that they can't shift. Our opponent's entire theme that Hezbollah can move somewhere else is disproven by this piece of evidence they've never responded to. Voting issue 2 is evidence. I have 3 subpoints. Subpoint A, the TBA is the United Nations of crime. We've already proved why the idea of them moving somewhere else doesn't matter, but let's just talk a little bit more about how the TBA is the worst. Let's talk about 3 pieces of evidence. First, our evidence that called it the United Nations of crime. Second, the evidence in the 1AC that called it, quote, Hezbollah's most important financial base, unquote. And third, that their evidence is flawed. Why? Because while a country might be secure as a whole, our region can be really dangerous. For instance, I live in Washington, and while the country as a whole is safe, there are some really dangerous neighborhoods. Very similarly, even if Paraguay as a whole might be safe, the TBA, according to our evidence that was never refuted, is the most dangerous. Subpoint B is advocacy. We read evidence from Tyler Stapleton in the first speech, specifically calling for our policy to be passed. Go with the evidence of the experts and pass our policy. And subpoint C is through the United States. We read 2 pieces of evidence here. First, my evidence that in one case alone, it was 420 million. Second, Winston's evidence from Dr. Emmanuel Ottolenghi saying that a lot of the money was going through the US financial system from the TBA. So my final voting issue is of goal achieved. What it boils down to is our policy does 2 things. It keeps Hezbollah out of the worst region, the TBA, and ultimately it blocks them from the US financial system and the global financial system, ultimately protecting our integrity. Thank you all so much for your time.
Great round, you guys.
Yeah, great
Thank
round.
you so much for taking your time.
Good job, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Great debate.
Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
All right, goodbye.